So today we're going to look at the skill of utility. So basically, what are we talking about when we talk about utility? So simple as this: is the source useful or is the source not useful? Alright, so the thing is that in utility, right, there are a few ways to check if a source is useful. Now, one of the most common ways, number one, is to check if a source is reliable, a source is useful. Of course, if a source is not reliable, the source is not useful. Okay, a second way of looking at usefulness is, now if the source is used in the right context, then yes, it is useful. Right? And the third one is the perspectives of the sources. So does it only talk about one side? Does it only say only good things about a particular topic? Or does it actually give both sides of the story? If it only gives one side of the story, then perhaps it is not sufficient. It is not useful enough because it doesn't give the other side of the story. Now, another way to look at usefulness is, even though the source may not be useful, okay, totally, okay, it still tells us something about the topic. Okay, I'm going to try my best to try to unpack all these different things within this particular video, and hopefully you'll be able to see as many possible examples as we can. Alright, so let's take a look at the example here. Just a very quick note, I've decided to use the same sources for the skill of reliability, utility, as well as the surprise skill. Okay, this is to illustrate that even though we have similar sources, perhaps the change of the provenance or the context of it used to actually ask a different kind of question, because the context is different, the way that you look at the source might also need to be a bit different in that sense there. Now we take a look at source A. I've actually added in, okay, or let's just take a look at here. It's by a Singaporean minister in a video promoting tourism in 2018. Alright, so if we take a look here, this actually tells us about how futuristic architecture meets lush greenery. Okay, imagine, towering structures, offering breathtaking views, meticulously maintained parks, pockets of rainforest, unique blend of urban and natural beauty. This tells us immediately that Singapore is an attractive place. Okay, attractive place, is a beautiful place, is a lovely place. These are some ways of looking at it. So, one way to actually find out whether or not this source is useful, perhaps, is to look at the reliability of the source. As I mentioned, if you have watched my video on reliability, if not, you can actually look at my video on reliability first before you look at utility. Because in my video on reliability, I mentioned that there are two possible ways to look at reliability. One is to do cross-referencing, is look at different sources, which I will look at later. Another way is by looking at the provenance. So in this case here, the provenance is by a Singaporean minister. So Singaporean minister, he's expected to say good things about Singapore, right? To say good things about Singapore. Okay, and if we can see this here, like what I said, number one here, he is expected to say good things, he will not say bad things. Okay, and of course he has a purpose behind it. What is the purpose here? Okay, and basically the purpose is to perhaps try to get more people to come to Singapore, or more tourists to come to Singapore. Now, if we look at this particular source, we can tell that this source is very one-sided. Okay, it only says all the good things about Singapore. Is it fully useful if we look at it from this perspective? Not really, because if we look at it from the point of view of the perspectives, it only tells us that it is only tells us the good things about Singapore. Does it say anything bad about Singapore? No. And because of that, right, it is not sufficient enough by looking at one perspective to actually conclude that the source is useful, because it only tells us one perspective. So that actually covers, if we look at this here, it actually covers this part here, the perspectives of the sources. Okay. Now, like I mentioned, the source may not be totally useful, okay, but it still may be able to tell us certain things. For example, what you could tell us, what the source could tell us is that, for example, this actually tells us about how ministers actually view Singapore. This actually tells us what Singapore would like to portray themselves to be. So it may not be useful because of, say, for example, it lacks the sufficiency, or in this case here, it is not reliable. But at the same time, it tells us what people in Singapore, or what the government of Singapore will want to portray to other people about Singapore. So this actually helps us to answer number 4, right? Now, if this source is used in the right context, it can be very useful. Now, if I'm asking you, what can you tell me about Singapore? And you tell me that Singapore is a very attractive place. This video is recorded, for example, this speech in a video was actually recorded in 2018. But in today's context, 2025, we may be seeing Singapore in a totally different light. So because it's 2018 and 2025, the time gap is very big. And because of that, right, it may not sufficiently tell us or give us a true picture of what Singapore is in 2025. Yes, it tells us about 2018, but it doesn't really tell us about 2025. So in this case here, it may not be very useful because it is a bit outdated. The information about Singapore is a bit outdated. So in this case here, I'm actually able to use this to talk about whether or not it's used in the right context. And I think I've mentioned about reliability in terms of checking whether or not the source is, whether or not the provenance actually helps to bring about the reliability. Of course, you can do cross-referencing as well. I will not be touching too much on it, because if you would like to, you can look at my video on reliability. So just remember, for utility, right, these are the few ways you can actually approach a utility question. Now, that said, if you look at all these 4 ways, these are 4 ways that you can check the usefulness of a source. But it doesn't necessarily mean that all of these options will give you a very high level in your answer.